Hey YouTube, this is Marcus or Gary again with another video. Today's video we're going to talk about 4K gaming. And I have a confession to make. I may have been mistaken about the capabilities of the Xbox One X, formerly known as Project Scorpio. I have said, perhaps on YouTube, I'm not sure, but I know on social media repetitively that I was very skeptical about the ability of the Xbox One X to actually do true 4K gaming. And I may have been seriously mistaken about that. I game on PC. My PC is more powerful than the Xbox One X. The graphical capabilities are about equivalent if you just go by the floating point performance, which mine's an overclocked RX 480, so it should hit about 6 teraflops ish, which is what the One X is rated at. But my CPU is more powerful than the Xbox One X. But my point is that my computer is more powerful than the One X, but not by much. And I game at 1080p because with my system at 1080p I can crank all my settings to max, ultra or whatever they call it in that game, and still hold 60 frames per second. And I think that that is a superior experience to playing games at 4K 30 frames per second, medium or high settings. I'd rather have 60 frames per second and ultra settings at 1080p. But I had never really tinkered around with 4K on my rig because I just assumed that since I was not hitting 200 frames per second on the games that I played, that I would not be able to do 4K, because it made sense to me that since 4K is 4 times the total pixel count of 1080p, that it would require 4 times the GPU horsepower. And then I got to thinking about things. I said, wait a minute, a 1080 or 1080 Ti is not 4 times as powerful as my graphics card, but people game in 4K on those cards. And so I just decided to do a little bit of experimenting. And the Radeon settings driver for my graphics card allowed me to turn on something that is called Virtual Super Resolution, where essentially, even though my display is 1920 by 1080, I can render images internally on the graphics card at higher resolutions, and then it just downsamples it onto my 1080p screen, the same as would happen if you used your Xbox One X to play a game in 4K, but your TV was only capable of 1080p. It would still render internally at 4K and then just downsample it, run it through a downsampling filter to a 1080p signal for your television. So that's basically what I did with my computer here. And then I went through and I ran some experiments with some games, and I was actually very pleasantly surprised. I tested Resident Evil 7, I tested Doom, I tested Fallout 4, Skyrim, and BioShock 2, the remastered version. I ran all of those games at 4K ultra maximum settings, and none of them dipped below 30 frames per second. That was just, Resident Evil 7, it's a Resident Evil game, and they I don't know why, but they're weird about their frame rates. They like to lock at specific frame rates, and so I set my VSync to variable in that game, and it seemed to want to lock at either 30, 45, or 60 frames per second. But the lowest I ever saw it with, in the few minutes that I tested it, was like a lot of ambient, like dust and stuff on screen. It dipped down to 30 frames per second. But it spiked higher than that most of the time to 45 or 60. Doom was running anywhere from 45 to 60 frames per second. Maximum settings, Vulkan API, 4K, true 4K, just being downsampled to a 1080p signal for this screen. BioShock 2, the remastered, never budged from 60 frames per second at 4K, and it doesn't have a whole lot of a ton of settings that you can adjust, but I had the settings that are there turned up to the maximum. Fallout 4, the worst frame rate I got was, I think I got a screenshot of it here, was when we landed and the vertibird was taking off and there was some dust, and my hard drive was actually still loading a lot of the stuff in the area around me. The frame rate dipped to like 31-ish. It was in the 30s. But, I mean, that's playable, especially single-player games like Fallout 4. If the lowest I see is 30 frames per second at 4K ultra settings, that's playable. That's totally playable. And I know consoles get a lot of shit for not having 60 frames per second on every game, but when you're playing with a controller, you're used to a more sluggish input anyway, and 30 frames per second is perfectly fluid enough for a single player game like Fallout 4. And I mean, if I can do that well at 4K with my little PC, I would say that the Xbox One X would be more than capable of doing true 4K, even if they had to turn the settings down off of Ultra, if they had to go with medium or high settings for a lot of games. It's possible. I've been wrong. I thought 4K required a lot more horsepower than it does. Now, to be fair, I'm not going to go out and buy a 4K monitor because I personally prefer 60 frames per second over 30 frames per second in 4K. So I'm going to continue to game at 1080p just so I can leave everything at ultra and still keep that 60 FPS lock. But that's my personal preference. 30 frames per second is still perfectly playable. I was a console player for most of my life, and 30 frames per second is perfectly fine. And so it's interesting. It's quite possible that the Xbox One X might actually offer a true 4K gaming experience to console gamers. And the crazy thing about it is that it is the price tag. It's only like, what is it, $500, I think? That's a pretty good price tag. Now, there are a lot of news articles coming out. I think Killing Floor 2, they said, is actually going to run at like 1800p instead of 2160p or 4K. So it's not going to be running quite at 4K, because they said the frame rate dips that were happening at 4K were not acceptable to them. And I don't know the details of how the game is running on that particular piece of hardware, but I'm going to guess that that's probably a CPU bottleneck, because unless they've made some significant changes to the CPU other than just overclocking the one that was already in there, that is going to serve as a bottleneck for the GPU side. Now, I know it's an APU where they're on the same die, but they are actually separate compute units within the APU. You have your CPU cores and your GPU cores on the same die. And unless they've made some significant changes to the chip other than just overclocking it, the CPU is probably going to bottleneck the GPU side of it in CPU-bound games. That may be what's going on with Killing Floor 2. Now, I don't have Killing Floor 2 on my PC, so I don't know much about it other than I think you kill zombies or something. But I just wanted to take a few minutes here to talk about the fact that I've been wrong. Because if my PC can run all these games at 30 to 60 frames per second, ultra settings at 4K, there's no reason a very slightly less powerful game console couldn't run true 4K with a 30 FPS lock at medium settings with 99% of games coming out today. And that's something that's it's interesting. I think it's pretty cool. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Leave a comment and tell me, are you going to buy an Xbox One X? Do you game on PC? Are you really not that worried about 4K? Is it not something you're terribly concerned about at the moment? Let me know in the comment section below. But I just wanted to brain dump for a few minutes and let you guys know how surprised I was at how easy it is to dabble in 4K gaming. This is Garrowin out. Y'all have a good one. Take care.